Lucas Pierce had lived on the outskirts of town for as long as he could remember. His house wasn't much to look at. A modest, aging structure with a red tin roof and faded siding that bore the weight of time and weather. The gravel driveway curved gently toward a wide, open yard where patches of wild grass were left to grow freely alongside neatly stacked lumber and a row of beehives. Lucas wasn't one for appearances. He valued function over form, quiet over attention, and the weight of routine over the noise of social approval. He had been a carpenter all his life, the kind who measured twice and cut once, the kind who didn't believe in throwing away what could still be fixed. He rarely left town, didn't speak unless there was something worth saying, and had developed a reputation in the community for being reliable, if a little gruff. People didn't bother him, and in turn, he didn't bother people. He liked it that way. The neighborhood had changed, though. Not overnight, but in slow, almost imperceptible shifts that eventually became impossible to ignore. First came the developers, with their gleaming SUVs and polished shoes, offering checks to the elderly couples who had once been Lucas's neighbors. Many accepted the money and moved to smaller homes or retirement communities. Their modest, clapboard houses bulldozed to make way for luxury builds with double garages and pale stone facades. Then came the people. Newcomers with bright smiles and expensive sunglasses, who talked about elevating the area and building community over wine tastings and yoga on the Greenbelt. A neighborhood committee formed, calling themselves the Resident Standards Group. But everyone knew it was just a sanitized version of a homeowner association, albeit one without formal jurisdiction over certain legacy plots like Lucas's. Still, they made their opinions known through both official-sounding letters and long, passive-aggressive Facebook threads. It was around this time that Karen Miller arrived. She moved into one of the newer homes on the other side of the street. A 2-story stucco box with unnaturally green turf and planters arranged with military precision. Karen was in her early 60s, heavy-set with a voice that somehow carried across fences and hedges. Her husband, Bill, owned a successful contracting firm, which Karen was always quick to mention in conversations, particularly when offering unsolicited advice about someone's front porch or fence color. She had a deep disdain for anything that didn't align with her vision of suburban perfection, which included barking dogs, lawn ornaments, mismatched patio furniture, and, most especially, Lucas's property. Karen viewed Lucas's land like a problem that needed solving. His beehives in her eyes were a biohazard. The stack of firewood beside his barn was a breeding ground for rodents. The dirt path leading to his workshop, where Lucas often spent evenings sanding reclaimed wood, was an eyesore. But her greatest complaint, the hill she seemed determined to die on, was the trash bin. Lucas kept his bins in a designated spot at the edge of his driveway, just beyond the tree line but fully accessible for pickup on Mondays. It was a system that had worked without issue for years, long before Karen arrived. However, shortly after moving in, Karen began parking her oversized SUV directly in front of his bin. Not close to it, not adjacent, but directly in front, making it impossible for the waste truck to pull in and collect. The first time it happened, Lucas assumed it was a mistake. He waited until the morning, then knocked on Karen's door. She answered with a forced smile, wearing a silky robe and holding a cup of herbal tea like a trophy. "Morning," Lucas said simply, nodding toward the street. "Your car's blocking my bins." Karen blinked. "Oh, I hadn't noticed. You really should think about moving them farther up your drive. It's a bit unsightly, don't you think?" Lucas looked at her, stone-faced. "They're exactly where the truck needs them to be. Always have been." Karen smiled wider. "Well, we all need to adjust sometimes. It's part of being a good neighbor." Lucas didn't answer. He just walked back down the driveway and went about his day. But the message was clear. This wasn't about convenience. It was about control. and Karen had decided that his bins, and by extension his land, were hers to police. The next week, the same thing happened. No trash pickup. Karen's SUV sat like a barricade, shiny and smug. Lucas didn't knock on her door this time. He simply hauled the trash back down to his barn, where he stored it in an old chest freezer he'd converted into a temporary holding bin. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of rising to the bait. But Karen wasn't content to just be a nuisance. She began escalating in small, infuriating ways. One afternoon, Lucas returned from the hardware store to find a laminated flyer pinned to his fence. It featured a smiling family surrounded by fresh grass and hydrangeas, and bore the words, "A clean community is a happy community. Let's keep our neighborhood beautiful." In smaller font, it read, "Voluntary standards for property improvement. Don't be the exception." No name, no sender, just the thin veneer of civility barely masking the insult. Lucas crumpled it and tossed it in the burn barrel behind the shed. Soon after, the resident standards group began forwarding anonymous complaints about odor from organic waste, visually aggressive fencing, and unlicensed agricultural structures. Lucas responded to none of them, because they had no jurisdiction. His property, inherited from his father, predated all the regulations they now tried to enforce. It was technically grandfathered in, and that technicality drove people like Karen crazy. When she realized paperwork wouldn't work, she tried social pressure. Neighbors who once waved now looked away. Someone threw a half-eaten sandwich into his yard. His supplier for fencing materials informed him that they'd been told not to deliver to uncooperative addresses. Still, Lucas said nothing. He kept his head down, did his work, and started keeping meticulous records. Photographs of her SUV blocking the bin, timestamps of trash pickups missed, notes on every interaction. Not because he intended to make a scene, but because he believed in being prepared. Karen, of course, saw his silence as weakness. She began inviting people over more frequently. Brunches, garden walks, little street fairs, all carefully staged to showcase her manicured yard in contrast to Lucas's cluttered lot. During one such gathering, a guest's child wandered into Lucas's yard and was gently escorted out. The next day, Karen filed a formal complaint alleging that Lucas created an unsafe environment for children. No investigation followed. There was no basis. But the implication lingered in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Still, Lucas refused to react. His approach was rooted not in fear, but in principle. He wasn't about to play her game on her terms. But deep down, something had started to shift. He had lived his whole life believing that if you did right by others, if you minded your business and worked hard, the world would leave you in peace. But now, for the first time, he began to realize that wasn't always enough. That sometimes peace had to be defended, not with fists or shouting, but with strategy, patience, and yes, the occasional calculated response. He didn't know it yet, but the final straw was coming. And when it did, when Karen finally crossed the line one too many times, Lucas Pierce wouldn't be asking for help. He wouldn't be filing a complaint or posting online. He'd be rolling out his tractor, loading the bucket, and letting years of quiet resistance spill out in a single, unignorable act of poetic retribution. And on that morning, when the sun rose over the cul-de-sac and the scent of spoiled garbage mingled with dew, no one would be able to say they didn't see it coming. Because some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed, especially when you block a man's trash. It was the third Monday in a row that the garbage truck passed Lucas's driveway without stopping. The sound of its brakes hissed at a distance, and then it rolled on down the road without even slowing. Lucas stood beside the bin, arms crossed, his face unreadable. The air was already thick with heat, the kind that made the flies slow and the smell of fermenting trash cling to the skin. He didn't curse, didn't shake his fist. He just stared down at the black plastic lid, already bulging with 2 weeks' worth of waste, and thought, not for the first time, that something had to give. The moment had crept up on him, not in a sudden burst, but in the quiet accumulation of frustrations. The overturned bin last week with its contents spilling into the ditch, the streak of something dark and sticky that led back toward Karen's driveway, the note shoved under his garage door that read, "Rot starts from the inside," in neat, feminine handwriting. None of it could be proven, none of it worth calling the sheriff about, but together they added up to a deliberate campaign of pressure. Lucas wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but he'd lived long enough to know when he was being targeted. The bin itself had become a symbol now. Not just a container for trash, but the front line of an undeclared war. And this morning, that war escalated. When Lucas walked up to the bin and tried to roll it toward the street, he felt resistance. Not the usual drag of weight, but something deliberate. He tilted it back, revealing a pair of flat metal spikes hammered into the gravel, positioned directly behind the wheels. He crouched, examined them without touching. They weren't hardware store stakes or random debris. They were heavy-duty roofing nails, likely pried from some old plank, sharpened and sunk into the earth like caltrops. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he stood, turned, and slowly scanned the yards nearby. Karen's house was quiet, blinds drawn. Her car, the same over-polished white SUV, sat in its usual place across the drive, not directly blocking the bin today, but angled just enough to make maneuvering difficult. The message was clear. "I could have blocked it again, but I didn't. Be grateful." Lucas went back to his barn, fetched a pair of gloves and a claw hammer, and returned to the spikes. He worked silently, pulling each one out with slow precision, placing them in a small metal pail. When he was done, he returned to the barn and stored them on a shelf above his workbench. He didn't throw them away. Not yet. Later that afternoon, as he sat on the porch with a glass of warm water, a gray sedan pulled into his drive, unfamiliar with rental plates. A woman stepped out mid-30s, wearing slacks and a sleeveless blouse. She introduced herself as Jennifer Ellison, a community liaison consultant retained by the local residential council to help resolve neighborhood disputes before they escalate. Lucas didn't offer her a seat. He didn't offer her water. He simply gestured for her to speak. She began with the usual: appreciation for the charm of older properties, acknowledgement of the value of diversity in architectural style, even a nod to the importance of heritage. But her tone soon shifted. There had been complaints, she said, about odors, about refuse not being contained, about insects, potentially dangerous swarms, about obstructed sidewalks and open-flame tools in an unregulated area. She used the word non-compliant 3 times in 5 minutes. Lucas let her talk. Then he stood and walked to the edge of the porch, pointing at the gravel shoulder by the drive. He didn't say a word, just pointed to the fresh impressions left by her tires. "See that?" he said finally. "That's the edge of my property. The bin goes here, not on the porch, not halfway up the drive. Here, always has. Trash company confirms it, GPS confirms it. County confirms it." Jennifer smiled politely, the kind of smile that professionals use when they know they're not getting what they came for. She thanked him for his time, promised to pass along his concerns, and left with the same calm indifference with which she arrived. Lucas watched the sedan disappear around the bend, then went inside and locked the door. That night, something changed. The smell from the bin, now tucked back beside the barn, was overpowering. Not just rotting food and paper waste, but something sharper, more caustic. Lucas opened it, gagged, and stepped back. Inside, beneath the trash bags, someone had poured what appeared to be ammonia. 2 empty bottles were buried beneath the rest of the waste. It wasn't just vandalism. It was meant to drive him out, force him to dump it early, violate a code, trigger a fine. He put the lid back on and rolled the bin into his walk-in cooler. The unit had long since stopped being used for honey. It was now repurposed, sealed, and ventilated. The perfect containment unit. The next morning, he bought a trail camera. Not one of the cheap plastic ones you strap to a tree to catch raccoons. A military-grade, motion-sensitive model disguised as a birdhouse. He mounted it above the bin area and let it run. Nothing happened for 2 nights. On the third, just past 2 a.m., the camera caught movement. A shadow crossing from the street onto his gravel path. A woman, stocky build, moving carefully. She crouched, reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out a small plastic container. She emptied it into the bin, then scurried back across the road. The camera didn't capture her face, but the time and direction made it obvious. The footage was burned to a drive, filed away. Lucas didn't go to the sheriff. He didn't file a report. He knew the law, and he knew where it failed. Vandalism had to exceed a dollar amount. Proof had to be facial or undeniable. Karen was smart. She always skirted the edge of legal consequence, always stayed just within the bounds of deniability. She wasn't stupid, just entitled. But that didn't mean Lucas was helpless. He started logging everything. Dates, times, temperature, wind direction. He marked where the truck stopped and didn't. He took daily photos of the bin's location. He called the waste company, spoke to the route supervisor, and politely requested the name of the driver. It wasn't for complaint, just information. He learned the pickup order, the time window. He noted everything. And then he waited. The build-up was not accidental. Lucas understood pressure. He'd grown up under it, raised by a father who believed that patience was not passive, but weaponized. Let people push, his father once said. The further they go, the harder the snap when you push back. Lucas had spent his life honoring that lesson, but even patience has its limits. So when the waste truck passed again on the 4th week, and Karen's car sat across the road like an ornament of malice, he didn't fume. He didn't shout. He simply opened the barn, pulled the tractor into the sunlight, and got to work. Not yet with the bucket. That would come later. First, he needed volume. He spent the next few days quietly collecting. From his land, from neighbors who didn't ask why. Chicken bones, spoiled fruit, fish scraps, broken egg cartons, raw compost, oily rags. He sorted it by type, sealed it into bins, and kept them cool. By the end of the week, he had several full barrels of organic rot. No gasoline, no bleach, no chemicals, just time, biology, and gravity. By then, Karen had started walking past the edge of his property in the mornings, holding her phone like a badge. Sometimes she said things under her breath. Nothing clear enough to be actionable, but enough to irritate. She wore big sunglasses and a sun hat like a shield, and she smiled like a politician. Lucas didn't respond. He just kept measuring. And when the time was right, when the bin was full, the air was heavy and the truck once again rolled past without stopping, he started the tractor, lowered the bucket, and drove slowly up the gravel. Karen's SUV was parked not directly in front of the bin this time, but on the shoulder, just angled enough to block any movement. Lucas put the tractor in neutral, sat for a moment. Then, with the kind of quiet that can only come from absolute certainty, he raised the bucket. And finally, Karen would learn what it meant to push the wrong man too far. The sound it made wasn't loud. It wasn't a crash or a cinematic smash. It was wet. A deep, slapping thud as the contents of the bucket hit the windshield of Karen's pristine white SUV in one massive, gelatinous wave. The garbage exploded over the glass, roof, and hood, a mixture of compost, spoiled meat, and week-old grease that clung to the car like syrup. Bits of fish skin slid down the sides. strings of decomposed vegetables slapped against the mirrors, and one entire bag of soaked trash didn't even split on contact. It landed and stuck like a tumor of decay. The smell rose immediately, oppressive and sour, with notes of rot and ammonia so thick it coated the back of Lucas's throat as he reversed the tractor with surgical precision and parked it back in the barn. He didn't look around for witnesses. He didn't need to. The moment was not for them. It was not for the neighbors behind their curtains or the joggers who would later claim they just happened to pass by. It was for him. For the silent accumulation of humiliation, the slow erosion of dignity, and the gut-wrenching frustration of watching someone violate your space while the world asked you to stay civil. The bucket dump wasn't vengeance. It was correction. Lucas shut off the engine, dismounted the tractor, and walked back to his house without so much as a glance over his shoulder. His boots tracked a line of damp dust across the driveway, and his pulse remained steady. He poured a glass of water, leaned against the sink, and listened. It took 12 minutes. 12 minutes before he heard the shriek, high, nasal, and furious, cutting across the stillness of late morning like a rusty blade. Then came the slam of a car door, followed by furious knocking, no, pounding, on his front door. Lucas didn't move. The knocking continued for another minute before the voice came through, muffled but clear. "You sick freak! You vandal! You think you can intimidate me? This is a crime." He waited. She didn't leave. Another 2 minutes of silence, and then, "I'm calling the police. I hope you're ready to be arrested." More silence. Then retreating footsteps, a car door, the squeal of tires. Lucas exhaled. He returned to the porch only once, to collect the trail camera which he disassembled and stored in a toolbox beneath the workbench. He didn't plan to use it again. It had served its purpose. The police arrived an hour later. 2 cars. One officer approached the house while the other lingered near Karen's SUV, still parked by the curb, now cordoned off by a small strip of yellow tape, as if the car were a corpse in a crime scene. The lead officer was young, polite, but weary. Lucas answered the door, invited him in, and gestured toward the kitchen table. "Mr. Pierce," the officer began, glancing down at a small notepad, "we received a report of property damage. Your neighbor, Karen Miller, alleges you intentionally vandalized her vehicle this morning using a tractor bucket full of garbage." Lucas nodded. "That's accurate." The officer blinked, caught off guard. "You don't deny it?" "No." "Can you explain the circumstances?" "I've documented 4 weeks of her blocking the county-designated trash pickup area on my property," Lucas said calmly, handing over a manila folder. Inside were photographs, printed emails with the waste collection company, a highlighted property map, and a short log of events. I tried to resolve it quietly. She escalated. What I did wasn't nice, but I'd argue it was provoked. And legal. Given the car was partially on my land. The boundary lines are marked in that survey. The officer thumbed through the documents, clearly uncomfortable. "You dumped waste on her car." "Biodegradable waste, yes. Organic, non-toxic, no chemicals. Just compost and spoiled food. I made sure of that." "Were you intending to damage the vehicle?" "I was intending to make a point." There was a long pause as the officer tried to decide how to proceed. Then, quietly, "Well, she wants to press charges." "I expected that." The officer stood, adjusting his belt. "We'll file the report. I can't say what'll happen. That's for the prosecutor. But, off the record, Mr. Pierce, you've covered your bases well." Lucas didn't smile. "I usually do." The officers left after 20 minutes. Karen stood in her driveway during the entire interaction, arms crossed, lips tight. As the squad car pulled away, she stormed toward Lucas's house again. this time with her phone held high, recording. "You think this is over?" she hissed from the edge of his lawn. "You think anyone's going to let you live here after this? You're disgusting. And I'm not backing down." Lucas said nothing. He simply stared at her until she broke eye contact and returned to her house. The garbage was still clinging to the roof of her SUV. One of the neighbors, a man Lucas didn't know well, passed by later that afternoon and chuckled. "Hell of a mess," he said, tipping his ball cap. "Hope it was worth it." Lucas answered without turning. It was necessary. But the mess wasn't over. That night the retaliation came, quieter but unmistakable. Lucas returned from his evening walk to find his workshop door ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing damaged, but a single sack of bee feed had been slit open and left spilling onto the floor. A passive threat. Not enough to report, just enough to raise the hairs on his neck. He didn't sleep much. The following morning the air smelled sweet. Not from flowers or honey, but from something artificial. Lucas followed the scent around the property and found 3 small, open containers of antifreeze poured near the fence line, exactly where his cats like to prowl. He moved fast, collected the bowls, checked the animals. They were safe, for now. That was the moment he stopped keeping things to himself. He went to the county office, not to file a complaint, but to schedule a full property boundary verification. Then he retained a civil attorney. Not a big firm, just a local woman who specialized in nuisance disputes and land use cases. He handed over his folder, his logs, the camera footage, and told her everything. She nodded without judgment. "You waited longer than most," she said, "and you documented better than almost anyone I've seen. Wasn't trying to win, just trying to live. Well, now you're trying to survive. And that means fighting back with paperwork, not just buckets." They filed an official complaint, not against Karen directly, but against her vehicle for repeated encroachment, against the neighborhood group for harassment by proxy, and against the waste management company for negligence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was strategic. Lucas didn't need to punish. He needed leverage. 2 days later, Karen posted a message in the local online bulletin board. "Some people don't belong in civilized neighborhoods. It's not just about cleanliness, it's about character. We shouldn't have to live in fear of tractors and filth just because someone refuses to conform." Lucas didn't respond. But 3 comments down, a user named Hawkgrove74 replied, "Fear's not the issue. Respect is. You lost his. That's on you." Lucas didn't know who wrote it, but it stayed up, unedited, unreported. The trash still wasn't being picked up, but Lucas didn't care. He'd stopped playing by their rules. He was building his own now. And Karen, for all her shrieking and scheming, had made a critical mistake. She escalated before she secured the high ground. Lucas was a man who measured everything, and now he was measuring her patience, her patterns, and most of all, her vulnerability. Because garbage wasn't the only thing that could be dumped, and he still had plenty left in the bucket. 2 weeks passed, and the neighborhood changed. Not in layout, but in temperature. Conversations became shorter. Sideways glances lasted longer. It wasn't that people hated Lucas now. It was that they were trying to calculate how close they could stand next to him without getting pulled into the undertow. Even those who privately admired what he did, dumping that bucket of justice, did so silently. Karen, meanwhile, shifted from open hostility to performative martyrdom. She'd been betrayed by the system, she claimed. Harassed, vandalized, left vulnerable by an unresponsive local government. She began walking her dog in full makeup, sunglasses on even at dusk, pausing conspicuously in front of Lucas's house to film the most mundane activities. Him unloading lumber, him adjusting irrigation, him walking across his yard. It wasn't for her benefit. It was for the court of public opinion. If she couldn't win through law, she'd try through shame. Lucas ignored her. That, in itself, was a kind of weapon. His attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace Rollins, had filed a petition for protective relief, citing property harassment, false claims, and public provocation. The paper trail was growing, and Grace, who had a background in municipal zoning law, began combing through the residential council's charters and complaint logs. Within days, she found something interesting. Karen had submitted 5 formal complaints about Lucas over the past 4 months, none of which had been signed by the required second homeowner, as mandated by council bylaws. More importantly, she discovered that Karen had been serving as an unofficial enforcement liaison, which granted her no real authority but had given her access to internal communications she wasn't supposed to have. They weren't going to sue her for that. Not yet. But they logged it. Just like everything else. Lucas didn't need to strike. He needed her to stumble. And stumble she did. It started with the bees. Lucas's beehives, tucked safely in a shaded grove near the rear of his property, had long gone unnoticed by most of the neighborhood. They weren't aggressive. He managed them responsibly. But one afternoon, while inspecting the frames, he found something strange. Tiny shards of greenish glass scattered near the base of one hive, mixed with what appeared to be granulated sugar. His stomach turned. Sugar laced with poison, possibly antifreeze, possibly pesticide. He called Grace immediately. She told him not to move anything. Within the hour, a private environmental technician was on site, collecting samples, taking photos, documenting the scene. The findings weren't immediately conclusive, but the signs were clear. It wasn't an accident. He didn't tell anyone what they'd found. Not yet. Let her think it hadn't been noticed. Let her feel emboldened. Then came the meeting. The council had scheduled a public hearing. Not a disciplinary one, but a community health and safety forum. Everyone knew what it was. A dog and pony show meant to call Lucas out indirectly, to give Karen a platform without putting her under oath. Grace advised Lucas to attend. He didn't want to, but he did. He arrived in his usual uniform, clean work shirt, jeans, boots, no fanfare. Karen was already there, seated in the front row, flanked by 2 of her friends and a man Lucas didn't recognize. Probably someone's lawyer. The meeting opened with the usual fluff. Updates on water use restrictions, landscaping credits, an upcoming fire drill. Then came the final item. Resident concerns regarding sanitation and environmental risks. Karen stood. She didn't look at Lucas. She looked at the audience. "I'm not here to point fingers," she began, and every word that followed made it clear that she absolutely was. "But we have to ask ourselves what kind of standards we're willing to uphold. It's not about new versus old, or rich versus poor. It's about safety, health. Our children play here. Our pets live here. We deserve better." She went on for 8 minutes. At no point did she say Lucas's name, but she didn't have to. When she finished, Grace stood. Calm, concise, professional. "My client, Mr. Lucas Pierce, is also a long-time resident," she said. "He's been subject to targeted harassment, documented trespassing, and suspected tampering with agricultural assets, all of which are supported by video, written correspondence, and physical evidence currently under review by a third-party laboratory." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone by name. She just laid it out. The poison, the camera footage, the unlawful vehicle obstruction, the retaliatory damage. "And let me be clear," Grace added, "if these actions continue, we will pursue all legal remedies, including criminal charges." The room was silent. Karen didn't speak again. After the meeting, no one approached Lucas. But that was fine. He hadn't come for allies. He came for positioning. Later that night, Karen's porch lights stayed off. Her car remained in the driveway, unmoved. The next morning, Lucas found a fresh orange peel in his mailbox, peeled but not eaten, stuffed down into the box like a dare. It didn't bother him. It confirmed everything. He spent the next day moving the hives farther back, building reinforced fencing around them. Not because he was afraid, but because he was preparing for the next phase. Grace called that afternoon to say the poison tests came back positive. Rat poison in the sugar. A mixture not sold over the counter. Definitely intentional. "Want to press charges?" she asked. "Not yet," Lucas said. "What are you waiting for?" "I want her to make the next move. I want it to be loud." And she would. Because people like Karen always overplay their hand. They push until the ground gives out from under them. And Lucas, calm, patient, methodical, was already holding the shovel. The question was no longer if, it was when. And he was ready. 3 days after the community meeting, the retaliation came in the form of silence. No more glares, no more flyers, no more passive-aggressive social media posts. Karen went dark, digitally, visually, audibly. Her routines changed. No morning walks, no SUV in motion, just stillness. For most people, that would be a welcome shift. For Lucas, it was a warning shot. She wasn't done. She was preparing something and she wasn't going to telegraph it this time. The illusion of calm was her way of resetting the chessboard, hoping he'd let down his guard. He didn't. In fact, he became more alert. The first clue came in a phone call from a local waste management official. The man was polite, almost apologetic. He informed Lucas that due to recent procedural reevaluations, his trash pickup had been suspended indefinitely. When Lucas asked why, the response was vague. Something about zoning reviews, temporary route realignments, and a pending permit question regarding organic material disposal on residential lots. Lucas pressed harder, and finally the official admitted there had been a complaint lodged by someone representing a neighborhood stewardship committee, alleging that Lucas had built an illegal waste processing station, specifically referencing the refrigeration unit in his barn. That unit, of course, had only ever been used to temporarily contain waste blocked by Karen's vehicle, and it had since been emptied and cleaned. But facts were secondary now. This was strategic. She was escalating the war to bureaucratic levels, paperwork, policy, red tape, not to win outright but to bleed him out in attrition. Lucas didn't panic. He responded with documents, service records, a notarized statement from the waste company driver who had repeatedly confirmed the obstruction. Grace helped him file a formal appeal, but it would take weeks. In the meantime, he was left with no legal method to dispose of his waste. He began stockpiling again, using sealed barrels and organic composting trenches he dug himself at the far edge of his property. Not ideal, but legal. Every step he took, he documented, time-stamped, cross-referenced. If Karen wanted a paper war, she'd get one, except Lucas wasn't using it to stall. He was building a fuse. Then came the drone. It was a warm Thursday morning, and Lucas was installing a new hinge on the gate that bordered his eastern field when he heard the telltale buzz. High, fast, intermittent. He looked up just in time to see a quadcopter hovering above his yard. Small, black, silent camera gimbal rotating slowly beneath it. It wasn't a toy. It was too stable, too methodical. It floated for a full minute above the composting area before veering left, scanning the barn, then drifting toward the beehives before ascending and returning west, right toward Karen's property. Lucas followed it with his eyes, watched it lower behind her roofline, and then disappear. He didn't chase it. He didn't need to. Instead, he filed a report. Not with the county, but with the FAA's regional office. He knew the law. Recreational drones weren't permitted for surveillance over private property, and even if local law enforcement wouldn't act, the FAA could. He logged the time, marked the path, and sent the complaint. Then he checked his own cameras. The motion-activated set facing the field, which had caught a perfect 10-second clip of the drone flying back to Karen's home. By the end of the week, things turned darker. One morning, Lucas woke to find a dead raccoon in his front garden, its body stiff, its eyes clouded. There was no blood, no signs of a fight. Just the animal, lying directly in the flower bed beneath the old oak, where he had planted lavender in memory of his wife. The implication wasn't subtle. He buried the raccoon with quiet precision, then pulled the hard drive from the nearest motion camera and checked the footage. Nothing. The camera had been disabled. Power interrupted for precisely 4 hours overnight. A cut cable. He followed the line to the utility box at the edge of the property. The latch had been forced open, the wires sliced. It wasn't vandalism, it was tactical. He replaced the cable, reinforced the lock, and upgraded the battery backup. Then he filed a second report, this time with the sheriff. He still didn't name Karen. He didn't have to. He just presented the facts. They took a statement and told him, once again, that unless he could identify a person on video, their hands were tied. So Lucas made a choice. He stopped playing defense. He called Grace and asked her to file an injunction, not against Karen personally, but against the neighborhood group itself. They'd overstepped. Their informal authority had turned into systemic harassment. The complaint outlined every incident: the poisoned sugar, the antifreeze, the dead raccoon, the drone, the garbage obstruction, the utility tampering. Names weren't listed, only positions and dates. But everyone knew who was pulling the strings. And while the legal wheels turned, Lucas started preparing for the inevitable physical escalation. He reinforced the barn doors with steel brackets. He moved the hives to a secure section behind the workshop. He installed 2 additional trail cams, one disguised as a sprinkler head, another hidden in the trunk of an old tree. He didn't sleep in his bedroom anymore. He moved into the workshop loft where he could hear everything, where he had line of sight to every approach. Then, just past midnight one Friday, it happened. He was lying in the loft, eyes closed, half asleep, when he heard the sound. Footsteps on gravel. Not boots. Sneakers. Fast. Deliberate. He didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. He waited. A low scrape, then a metallic clink, then the distinct hiss of spray paint. He moved like muscle memory. Down the ladder, across the barn, out the side door. He didn't flip on the floodlights. He didn't shout. He just walked, silent and steady, toward the front gate. And there, under the pale moonlight, he saw them. 2 figures in hoodies, one holding a spray can, the other standing lookout. On his fence in thick red paint were the words, "Pig Stee." The lookout saw him first. "Hey, he's coming." They ran. Not fast enough. Lucas followed, not with speed, but with purpose. The pair slipped through the edge of Karen's yard, over her side fence, and vanished behind her house. Lucas didn't chase. He just stood there, breathing heavy, heart calm, and stared at the painted message. In the morning, he took photos. Then he took the paint can the vandals had dropped in their rush, still half-full black matte finish, and placed it in a sealed bag. Evidence. He didn't clean the graffiti. He left it, let everyone see it, let it hang like a flag. The next day, he received a letter, not from Karen, not from the neighborhood group, from the city. It was a notice of intent to investigate his property for environmental violations, citing unauthorized disposal of organic waste, potential rodent infestation, and offensive odors reported by multiple residents. It was official. Signed. scheduled. The inspection would occur in 10 days. Lucas sat in his workshop, staring at the letter, and didn't move for an hour. It was the final move, the bureaucratic kill shot. She couldn't force him to move, but she could drown him in inspections, citations, hearings, unless he buried her first. That evening, he poured himself a drink, not in celebration, but in resolve. The gloves were off now, and Karen had given him something better than revenge. She'd given him permission. The morning of the inspection arrived gray and still, with a low mist settling over the fields like a quiet warning. Lucas was up before dawn, not to prepare, not to hide anything but to work, just like any other day. He sanded the frame of an old rocking chair he'd been restoring, its cracked oak now smooth under his palm. The barn door was open, his yard untouched. The graffiti still marked the fence in bold red letters, half faded by weather, but unwashed. He had considered painting over it, but no. Some things were better left visible. At 9:03 a.m., the inspection team arrived. A city vehicle, one uniformed inspector, a clipboard, and a camera slung around his neck like a leash. The man introduced himself, offered a rehearsed smile, and informed Lucas that, per protocol, the inspection would include visual observation of waste storage, livestock presence, composting systems, and potential public nuisances. Lucas nodded. He didn't argue. He simply opened the gate, gestured for the man to proceed, and followed him in silence. The inspector moved carefully, taking photos of the bins, the trench, the hives, the barn exterior. He noted dates on posted permits, temperature gauges, and sanitation logs. Lucas handed him a folder, detailed documentation of everything the man was there to question: receipts, environmental consultant letters, photographic proof of tampering and cleanup. He didn't speak unless asked. He didn't explain unless prompted. He let the facts speak, and the silence fill in what his words would have only diluted. But what the inspector didn't expect, what changed the course of the entire morning, was the arrival of the second party. Karen appeared 15 minutes into the inspection, walking briskly from the far side of the road with a binder clutched to her chest and a legal pad under her arm. She wasn't part of the inspection team. She wasn't a city employee, but she was determined to insert herself anyway. Her voice rang across the yard before her feet even reached the gravel. "Excuse me, I have documentation relevant to this inspection," she called, waving her hand like a substitute teacher trying to reclaim a rowdy class. The inspector looked up, puzzled, then back at Lucas. "She's not authorized," Lucas said, his voice calm but heavy. Karen ignored him, stepping onto the property line like it didn't exist. "I represent the Neighborhood Stewardship Committee, and I have evidence of consistent sanitary violations." Lucas took a step forward, not threatening, just immovable. "You're trespassing." "This is a public inspection," she said sharply. "No," said the inspector. "This is a scheduled municipal inspection of a private residence, and unless you're here by formal designation, I can't accept your participation." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in weeks, she hesitated. Lucas turned toward the inspector. "Do your job. She can wait outside the gate." For the next 10 minutes, Karen stood fuming near the road while the inspector continued. He took soil samples, checked drainage, photographed the compost lids. Everything was in order, nothing violated, nothing even bordered questionable. Lucas had made sure of that. When the inspection concluded, the man signed the form, shook Lucas's hand, and left with nothing to report. Karen didn't follow. She just stood there, watching the door of the truck shut, the vehicle drive off, and the opportunity slip through her fingers like dry ash. Lucas didn't gloat. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. And that's when she snapped. "You think this is over?" she hissed, crossing back onto the gravel. You think you can keep hiding behind paperwork and loopholes? You're a disease in this neighborhood. You bring it down just by existing." Lucas didn't blink. "You think you're smart?" she spat. "Dumping your filth on my car, turning the neighbors against me, playing the victim while you stockpile garbage like some kind of lunatic. You don't belong here." She was screaming now, her voice cracking, face flushed red, eyes wild. And then something happened that neither of them expected. From down the road, a voice called out. Firm, steady. "Ma'am, I'd advise you to step back." A sheriff's deputy, one Lucas had spoken to weeks prior, had deparked at the end of the road, watching the scene unfold from a distance. He approached slowly, hand resting casually on his belt, eyes locked on Karen. "This is private property," the deputy said. "You've been asked to leave." Karen's face twisted. "He's the one breaking the law. He poisoned animals. He dumped trash. He destroyed—" The deputy cut her off. "That's enough. Step back to the sidewalk or I'll have to escort you there." She stared at him for a long moment, and then something in her cracked. She turned and marched away, muttering something incoherent. Binder clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The deputy waited until she was out of earshot, then turned to Lucas. "We've had eyes on your street since the last report. Just in case, heard this inspection was scheduled. Figured it might get loud." Lucas nodded once. "Appreciate it." "She's not done, you know," the deputy added. "People like that don't stop until they run out of ground to stand on." Lucas looked toward the fence, toward the red letters still scrawled there. "Then maybe it's time I started digging." That afternoon, Lucas met with Grace. She had been building something while the harassment played out. A coordinated legal action, not just an injunction, not just a restraining order, but a multi-pronged case built on trespassing, defamation, false reporting, attempted sabotage of agricultural assets, and interference with municipal services. The evidence was airtight. Every incident had been recorded, documented, witnessed, or acknowledged in some form. Grace had even secured the FAA's violation report from the drone incident, which clearly tied back to Karen's address. "It's all here," she said, laying out the files on his workshop table. "We could file tomorrow, but if you're ready, I say we go public." Lucas didn't flinch. "Do it." "And the restraining order?" "File that, too." That night, the papers were served. Karen received hers on the front porch, frozen in disbelief, binder still in hand. A neighbor snapped a photo from across the street, not out of spite, but out of vindication. By morning, the neighborhood knew. Not because Lucas said anything, but because silence, real silence, finally returned. The kind that didn't buzz or hiss or scrape, just whined through the trees, the low hum of bees in the grove, the slow shifting of a battle finally tipping. For the first time in months, Lucas slept without waking once. And when morning came and the sun crept over the horizon, he stepped outside, looked at the red words on his fence, and smiled. Not in triumph, not in gloating, but in quiet, exhausted relief. Because in the end, it wasn't the garbage, the graffiti, or even the poisoned soil that defined the war. It was who outlasted the rot. And Lucas Pierce was still standing. 2 months later, the fence was clean. Not just scrubbed, but sanded, primed, and repainted. Every inch of wood restored to a quiet, even dignity that had been missing since the red spray paint first hissed across its surface. Lucas had done it himself, without help, without ceremony, on a cool morning just after the first real autumn wind passed through the trees. He didn't rush the job. He worked like he always did, measured, patient, deliberate. When it was finished, he stepped back and looked at it not with pride, but with peace. It no longer carried the weight of conflict. It was just a fence again. Karen's house was empty. The for sale sign had gone up 2 weeks after the restraining order was granted. not long after the city dismissed all inspection concerns on Lucas's property and issued a formal statement that there had been no violations, no hazards, no cause for further involvement. The drone case had been quietly settled with a civil fine, though Grace had ensured the FAA report was included in the civil record for any future disputes or background checks. Word traveled quickly. Realtors whispered. Neighbors speculated. And Karen, who once strutted through the cul-de-sac like a self-appointed queen, had disappeared with only a single moving truck and a half-hearted attempt at an estate sale. Lucas didn't watch her leave. He didn't stand by the window. He was in his workshop that day, sanding a maple plank to use in a new kitchen table. He heard the truck, felt the vibration through the ground, but he never looked up. He didn't need to. The sound of her departure was more meaningful than any conversation could have been. Some endings didn't require witnesses. They only needed silence. The neighborhood, as if taking a collective breath, slowly exhaled. Conversations began again, cautious at first, then warmer. A few neighbors stopped by, offering small gestures. A pie left on his porch with a note, a spare bag of feed for the bees, a quiet thank you from a man down the street who had once filed a complaint under pressure from Karen, but now apologized with eyes that didn't look away. Lucas accepted each with polite reserve, never asking for more. He didn't need apologies. He needed respect. And now, finally, it was being returned. The garbage truck resumed its route, never missing a pickup. The driver gave Lucas a thumbs up on the first morning back, a small nod of solidarity between men who'd seen how systems could fail, and how they could be forced to work again with the right kind of pressure. Lucas nodded back. One weekend, a new family moved into Karen's old house, a young couple, probably in their 30s, with 2 kids and a Labrador. They didn't come with banners or gift baskets or welcome parties. They came with tools, unpacked boxes, and laughter in the backyard. Lucas watched them for a moment from the edge of his property, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. The father waved. Lucas raised a hand in return. No words, just enough to acknowledge, "We start clean." Grace visited one final time to close the file. She brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, which surprised him. "You're officially free of legal entanglements," she said, handing him a thin manila folder with a stamped letter of resolution. "But you should keep this anyway, just in case someone like her moves in again." Lucas accepted the folder, set it aside without opening it, and poured them each a glass. "Why'd she hate me so much?" he asked after a pause. Grace tilted her head, thought for a moment. "You were a reminder that she couldn't control everything. You stood your ground. That terrifies people who live off illusion." Lucas sipped his wine. "I didn't want a fight." "But you finished one," she replied. "And that's more than most do." After she left, he walked the perimeter of his property, the late sunlight cutting through the leaves like golden thread. He checked the hives, the compost trench, the fences. Everything was as it should be, as it had been before. But he was different now, not hardened, not bitter, just sharpened. He had learned the difference between peace and submission, between tolerance and erasure, between silence and weakness. And he had learned that the only thing more dangerous than being underestimated was being patient. Later that evening, he sat on his porch with a coffee and watched the dusk roll in. The new neighbors had set up a small fire pit. Their kids were chasing each other in circles. The dog barked once, then curled at their feet. No screaming, no drones, no trespassers. Just life, imperfect and real. Lucas didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He just sat there, watching, feeling the weight of the last few months settle into something solid beneath him. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something simpler. Something better. It was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like home again.